You are listening to the Final Say Radio Show, a Rappaport media production, with your host Brett Rappaport and co-host John Rappaport.
We have our guest on from the wonderful Washington Examiner. You can go to WashingtonExaminer.com. Brian Hughes is with them. He's the White House correspondent. Brian, first of all, welcome to the Final Say Radio Show. Thank you very much for joining us to discuss Ebola.
Hey there, how are you doing? Thanks for having me.
I was just mentioning before, I noticed that Sierra Leone has started a nationwide lockdown, I guess for 3 days, to try to combat what they, this outbreak of Ebola where thousands of people are dead in this region.
It's obviously the response so far from the administration is more Africa-focused, and that's why we're seeing the things we're seeing now. But when you have, an endgame where there are reports of this could get up to hundreds of thousands of cases, what we've seen so far is kind of just the tip of the iceberg. So it's going to be interesting to see where we go from here.
Yeah, it's very interesting. So now, let's go back a few. I guess it could be a month or so already, but we had some Americans who had gone over there, working as doctors who were trying to help people in Africa. They contracted Ebola. They were given, I guess experimental drugs. I forget the name of it exactly, but they were brought back to Atlanta, and so it would be interesting to know how they're doing, but also, your comment or thoughts on if you thought it was a good idea to bring people who have Ebola to the United States, but also, what is the White House saying about this? Are there any special steps that are be taken here in the United States? And then also, what are the United States and other advanced, medically speaking, societies doing to help Africa right now?
Yeah, it's interesting because there's this whole kind of medical ethics question in the beginning of how is it fair that you just get to bring back these couple people to the United States to get access to better medicine when there are thousands and thousands of people in Africa who are having problems or never going to have access to this. The administration itself has been kind of mum on that, and their answer essentially amounts to, look, when we have Americans, we're going to do everything we can to help them. And as we've seen so far, there have been positive strides made where these people have benefited. What you're seeing in terms of the administration response so far, initially it was very small. It was something along the lines of a 25-bed hospital. Now we're looking at somewhere around $750 million where the money is going to be used to train more workers in Africa. It's going to be used to establish up to 17 facilities in Liberia. But again, when you talk to people who know a lot more than I do about this, they say, this is just the beginning, and we're going to have to pour a lot more money into this if we're actually serious about getting something done.
Yeah, and you bring up a good point. I mean, there's certainly the ethical question of how could advanced societies within the world sit back and watch this type of thing happen elsewhere, especially in places where they can't necessarily do anything about it. And do we have some sort of a duty to step in and help them? But also, and I think the world has changed, and I think people travel. It's much easier to travel in many different ways, and so diseases could actually, I think, spread much quicker. Where we may have advanced medicines, they can certainly advance and spread as quickly as, say, technology. And right. So I think being able to understand where people are, finding out who has certain diseases and being able to contain it to not spread to other regions that may, at this point, not have it, is something that I think every nation needs to be concerned about.
Right, and that's the scary part. That's what everyone immediately, they think of the worst-case scenario and wonder what happens if it comes over here. And talking to experts on this, they actually do agree with what the president is saying at large, that the risk of an outbreak here, at least so far, is very minimal. But yet at the same time, you do have critics, especially of the administration, like Rob Portman and other Republicans who say they aren't doing enough in terms of screening procedures. The administration has taken some steps, but I know there are some, particularly on the other side of the aisle, who say they need to do more, so it'll be interesting to see how they adjust their procedures at ports of entry as this goes along. I would imagine you probably will see something else heighten it in addition to what we've seen so far.
Now, I hope I'm getting this correctly, because I had looked through one of your articles here discussing this, and am I reading this correctly? The president intends to send 3,000 military personnel to West Africa?
Yeah, it's up to 3,000. Now, I know when you hear military, the first thing a lot of people might think is something in a combat capacity. That's not what they're going. Therefore, they're going there to monitor the situation and help with training and things like that. And when it's, quote, military personnel, that's a lot of things fall under that. It's not necessarily just troops, but it's a lot of different positions associated with the Pentagon and different types of medical training. So that's what it is. It's kind of an inexact number, but essentially that's what you're looking at.
Sure. No. I understand that. I'm sure a lot of these are people who are medically trained or experienced in quarantine or procedures to deal with disease and whatnot. I guess the concern I have is putting 3,000 U.S. troops of any sort in harm's way. It's definitely a concern to me, and as it is to each of these individuals. And I just kind of find it ironic that you're willing to put troops on the ground, if you will, to combat disease, which I guess by definition isn't exactly what the military is for, but you're not willing to commit them to fighting, a real threat that's killing Americans, where you've seen several members of the media recently beheaded.
Right.
It's
an interesting semantics game, because we've talked about this a lot, how the administration's kind of evolved from in the beginning when they were talking about how they were going to respond to ISIS. It was, or in Iraq, it was just always, quote, no troops on the ground. And then as they went along and they realized they need to adjust their strategy, it turned into no combat troops on the ground. So it's this idea of what technically is boots on the ground. And depending on who you ask in the administration, as we've seen, they kind of give a different interpretation, so it's a little bit all over the map.
So two questions on your first point here. Is it too little, too late? I guess I would bring up George Bush, W. I think he did a tremendous job, especially for American president, in trying to help the African nations, especially with regards to AIDS. He said he was going to do certain things, and he did. And I think he's been recognized by a lot of those nations for the fine work that he did, or at least, set the initiative to have Americans go and help, and we put money behind it. And I'm sure we've saved a lot of African lives. And that's a good thing. But has this administration lived up to, I guess, the legacy, if you will, of what George W. Bush had started? And are we, in fact, responding too late to this threat? Because could we have done something, or should we have done something sooner, say months and months ago, when this first started to rear its ugly head?
Yeah, if you heard what was coming from leaders of African nations for weeks and weeks, their response kind of amounted to where is the United States here? There were the isolated cases of the Americans where we responded, but we didn't have that large of a response, and essentially their complaint was, you have to catch this early, and if you don't, it just compounds and multiplies, and it's a huge wasted opportunity, and then you're going to have to come back around and make up for that anyway. So, that there has been a lot of second guessing there. The administration says, not surprisingly, they think they're handling it properly. But to your Bush question, that's been the case for the last few years. He's kind of had to work in the shadow of the Bush legacy. Say what you want about George W. Bush on a variety of issues, but one thing where he got overwhelmingly positive marks from both sides of the aisle was for how he dealt with Africa, particularly the investments in AIDS, HIV research. And when Obama took over, especially as the nation's first African-American president, the expectations were massive for what he would do, and I think it would be fair to say that, at least in the beginning, he didn't meet those. His administration has been over backwards to kind of respond to that criticism. They held a summit here recently that was kind of the biggest summit they've ever held on African issues, but this Ebola in particular will go a long way in cementing his legacy, either for the better or for the worse.
Oh, sure. And we had followed that summit, and I think there was 31 or 32 nations, if I recall, that had participated in, and it was very interesting. And Ebola was one of the things that was heavily discussed, along with trade and of course the security threats that a lot of those nations face. And so there's a whole host of issues here that the administration should be focused on in Africa.
Mm-hmm.
But getting back into the threat of Ebola, you mentioned here that the World Health Organization estimates that it can cost up to $1 billion just to keep Ebola limited to tens of thousands of patients. Right. And so, I guess for us that's like a spit in a bucket. For an African nation, that's quite a bit of money.
Quite a bit of money, and tens of thousands of cases isn't exactly the best thing in the world either, right?
No, but I would just make the argument. Look, I don't care what we have to spend. I'd rather spend it on this than some of the other things that we waste, not just billions but trillions on.
Yeah, I mean it's interesting because at least so far Congress, who's been reluctant to go along with the president on much of anything, at least agrees with the initial ask. It kind of took the problems with Ebola and the problems with the Islamic State for everybody to get on board with the funding request, and it's like, it's such a surprising thing here in Washington, but a couple beheadings and this widespread pandemic, and here we are suddenly bipartisanship's in the air.
Yeah, but when I look at this though, what makes us such an exceptional nation is our abilities, but two, what we do to help others around the world. And we have a duty based on the country that we built to help people in need. I'm not saying we have to give away the farm, but we could surely afford not just $1 billion. If it took $10 billion to help save lives in these countries, we could do it. We could afford it. We certainly have the medical teams to help, first go there and help them, but train on the ground in some of these nations what they really need. But maybe we should be focused on that, because this isn't the first Ebola outbreak. This has been going on for a long time. And I forget what the initial one is, but this is really decades of Ebola. And, in fact, before they realized it was Ebola, it still existed. They just probably called it something else. But we should be trying to train response teams, at least in Africa. So maybe next time we don't have to get involved, but they will have the teams in place or the proper funding, whether it be through the UN or whoever, to respond to this the next time, because there will be next time.
Right, and that's basically the president's message. If you saw his remarks this week, it was basically that the world looks to the United States, and we're uniquely prepared to fund this initial task, and we're going to do it. And he's framing it as if it's a moral imperative, and I think you're seeing a lot of people, including Republicans, going along with that sentiment.
Yeah, well, every once in a while we could agree with the president, and maybe not fully on everything that he's doing, and throughout the handling of this, but we can't fight over every issue.
There are even limited things that it seems that are kind of no-brainers, right?
Yeah. So do you have any information on it? To be honest with you, I haven't followed closely the two doctors back here. I know one seemed to be doing better and one may have taken a turn for the worse, but do you have any update on how they're doing?
As far as to be honest with you, I don't, and I wouldn't speculate, especially on the latter one, which is more up in the air. I mean, there was the one successful case, and Obama, met with the survivor in the Oval Office, so that shows you how well that went. But again, it's very case by case, and the medicine itself is unproven. So I mean, while we're seeing good things for certain individuals, it really is one of those case by case things.
And boy, I got to tell you, the president meeting with anyone who's had Ebola, I think, is the best. I know the optics might be good, but
you would like to think if they're bringing them to the Oval Office, they're good to go. I'm pretty sure that person was the most heavily scrutinized entrant of the Oval Office in the history of the White House. So I don't think you have anything to worry about.
I know, still one chance I wouldn't be taking, but
yeah, neither would I. But what are you going to do?
That's just me. Anyway, Brian, I know if we can, do you have a few more minutes, or?
Yeah, sure, why not?
Okay, I know you've written on some other things here, and I wanted to get your opinion on a few of these things. But I guess it was actually the same day. I'm sorry, but you talked about the House vote was a step forward in combating the Islamic State.
Mm-hmm.
And I agree with that. And again, it's another one of these stories where we're getting a little bit of agreement on. But again, do you think that the White House is clearly understanding what it is they're dealing with, and are they being given the correct information and analysis to come up with the right strategy facing the Islamic State or ISIL or ISIS,
mm-hmm.
whatever we want to listen?
Yeah, I mean that is the fundamental criticism, that it took too long and that they still haven't yet clearly articulated exactly what their blueprint is, right? I mean, he's the president, as Republicans would say, have said a lot of things that he's against doing in the Middle East, but what he hasn't said clearly, according to a lot of them, is what he actually wants to do. And that's why, he had the address to the nation, the administration is trying to put more people out front, but when you get to these very specific questions, like today it was, have you already authorized airstrikes in Syria, they're very close to the vest because, quite honestly, I think they're still trying to figure it out. So, there's been dozens and dozens, actually a couple hundred almost now, airstrikes in Iraq. So their response is, you can criticize us all we want, but look at all the bombings we're doing in Iraq. Republicans would say that's not a long-term strategy and that those isolated airstrikes alone aren't going to do it. So, they're very conscious of it because it's something, especially ahead of November, it's getting, I don't think a lot of people realized how much national security would play heading into November, and the White House is trying to articulate a better answer, that's for sure.
Well, that's a great point, and we saw that when Harry Reid said that the Senate, I think it was Harry Reid, but the Senate basically said they weren't going to take up any further discussion on this until after the midterm elections. So clearly none of them want to go on the record one way or another with regards to these issues. But I would just say this, and this is my opinion, of course. When it comes to dealing with these types of threats, that's the duty of Congress, not to postpone it until it's politically favorable for them, but to actually deal with these issues in a timely manner. And right now, I think this threat is much more significant. I think, I feel like it's just related to this one region, but there are close connections to all these terrorist factions or extreme wings of whatever you want to refer to, and they're operational throughout the world. And there are going to be, attacks in Asia. There'll be attacks in Africa. There'll be attacks here, South Central America, in the Middle East, in Europe. They're going to happen at some point. They're going to be sporadic. We don't know when they're going to come. But the threat has to be dealt with, and it's not just and I agree, on one hand, we don't necessarily want to just say, hey, let's put 500,000 troops back on the ground. But we also have to understand that dropping a bomb on somebody isn't going to end the threat. And just like, if you go back to Vietnam, all they have to do is hide underground in the tunnels, and when the bombing's done, they come back out and fight another day. Mm-hmm. And so, ISIS isn't going away until we actually deal with the root threat.
Yeah, and it's particularly troubling for Obama because his whole political identity was shaped by being the guy who was against going into Iraq in the first place. This is exactly what he didn't want to be talking about heading into his final 2 years in office, and it's overshadowing everything else. So that's why he was so reluctant in the beginning, but, as presidents learn, world circumstances force you to address them whether you want to or not, and that's what we're seeing right now.
Well, that's right. And, the reason that we want to look for qualified people to be president is so we have somebody who could handle crises. We don't know what the crisis is going to be, but they have to be able to handle it. And,
right.
That's what we're looking for here.
Yeah. That's what's on the wanted poster, that's for sure.
Absolutely, and hopefully we'll get that in 2016. Brian Hughes, I want to thank you so much for joining us today on the Final Say Radio Show. Brian Hughes, folks, is the White House correspondent with the Washington Examiner. Again, you can go to thewashingtonexaminer.com. And Brian, do you have a Twitter handle or Facebook you'd like to share with our audience?
You check it out at Brian Hughes, DC.
Excellent. Well, thanks again so much, and we look forward to having you back on the program. Take care.
All right, thanks so much.
All right, so long.
Bye.